My parents stole my Mustang, which I had been restoring for a year, for their golden boy, but I took them to court. Hey everyone. Before I get into the story, I just want to ask you all to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. The channel's been getting low views lately, and not many people stick around till the end. Your support would really help keep things going. Now let's get into it. Hi Reddit. I don't really know how to start this, but I guess I've always been invisible. At least, that's how it felt growing up in my family. My younger brother Ryan was the golden child, and I was just there. If you asked my parents, I'm sure they'd say they loved us both equally, but actions speak louder than words. And their actions? Well, they made it clear who the favorite was. Ryan got everything he wanted. If he mentioned he was interested in playing guitar, he had a brand new Fender within the week. If he decided he wanted to try basketball, my parents signed him up for private lessons, got him the best gear, and made sure to attend every single game. Me? I got practical gifts. Clothes, school supplies, things I needed. And when I wanted to play soccer, I got a used pair of cleats from a thrift store and a "we'll see" when I asked if they could come to my matches. They never did. One of the worst moments was my high school graduation. It was a big deal for me. I'd worked my ass off, juggling school and part-time jobs to save up for college since I knew my parents weren't going to help. The graduation ceremony was long, sure, but it was important. I remember asking them if they were coming, and my mom just sighed. Do we have to? Those things take forever. Meanwhile, Ryan had some minor award ceremony in middle school, and they were their front row, taking pictures like he'd won an Olympic medal. By the time I hit my late teens, I knew better than to expect anything from them. If I wanted something, I had to get it myself. So I did. I got a part-time job when I was 16, working at a local garage. The old guys there took a liking to me and taught me everything they knew about fixing cars. I picked it up fast. Turns out, when you're desperate to prove yourself, you learn quickly. I started doing side jobs, fixing up cars for people in the neighborhood. Every dollar I made, I saved. I knew that the day I turned 18, I was on my own. And I was right. When I told my parents I wasn't going to the local community college like they suggested, but instead going to trade school for auto mechanics, my mom just shrugged and said, well, as long as you can pay for it. No encouragement. No excitement. Just that. Meanwhile, Ryan had just decided he wanted to be a filmmaker. Within a month, my parents had paid for him to go to an expensive summer program, bought him a professional camera, and set up a home studio for him in the basement. It wasn't even jealousy at that point. It was just exhausting. So I stopped trying. I finished trade school while working full-time, living off cheap food and barely scraping by. But I made it. I got my certification, got a decent job at a repair shop, and by the time I was 20, I was making enough to start saving for something bigger. While Ryan was still living at home, having every expense covered while he focused on his art, I was figuring out how to get my own shop one day. I don't think my parents ever really noticed the difference. Or if they did, they didn't care. But here's the thing about being ignored your whole life. It makes you stronger. It teaches you to survive without anyone's help. And one day, when they finally do notice you, it's too late. And trust me, they were going to notice me soon. But not in the way they expected. Growing up, there was only one person who ever really saw me, my grandfather, George. He was a Vietnam veteran, a retired mechanic, and the only man in my family who seemed to give a damn about me. While my parents brushed me off and Ryan basked in their constant attention, Grandpa George was the one who actually noticed me. He had a small garage behind his house, packed with old tools, rusting car parts, and the smell of motor oil permanently soaked into the walls. It wasn't much, but to me, it felt like a second home. When I was a kid, he'd let me sit on an overturned bucket while he worked, explaining what each tool did and how engines worked. At first, I was just there because it was better than being ignored in my own house. But over time, I started paying attention, asking questions, getting my hands dirty. By the time I was 12, I was helping him take apart carburetors and clean them. By 13, I could reassemble an alternator on my own. And by 15, I could diagnose engine issues better than most guys working at quick lube joints. Grandpa George would always say the same thing whenever I got something right. See, kid, you got a good head on your shoulders. Real talent, real skill, and real skill needs to be supported, not ignored. He never said it outright, but I knew he was talking about my parents. My 15th birthday was the moment that really sealed it for me. My parents had forgotten, plain and simple. No cake, no dinner, no happy birthday, Alex. Ryan had some big soccer tryout that day, and that was all that mattered. I waited all day, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd realize. But they never did. Grandpa George, though, he didn't forget. That evening, he showed up at our house, knocking on the door with a box in his hands. "Happy birthday, kid," he said, handing it to me with a smirk. I opened it and just stood there, staring. It was a set of brand new snap-on wrenches, socket sets, pliers, the works. The kind of tools I'd been dreaming about every time we went into a hardware store. I looked up at him, my chest tight. I figured it was about time you had your own set, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Can't be borrowing mine forever, huh? I swallowed hard, nodding. Thank you, Grandpa. Real talent needs the right tools, he said. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, I sat in my room, holding the tool set like it was the most valuable thing I owned. Because, in a way, it was. It wasn't just tools. It was proof that someone believed in me. From that point on, I spent every free second in his garage, learning everything he could teach me. He taught me things they didn't cover in trade school, tricks of the trade, little mechanical hacks, the kind of knowledge only years of experience could give you. More than that, he gave me something I never got from my parents: respect. By the time I turned 18, I was working at a local shop, making decent money, saving up. I wasn't sure what my next step was, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be stuck in my parents' house, playing second fiddle to Ryan for the rest of my life. And then Grandpa George gave me something that changed everything. It was my 18th birthday, and I wasn't expecting much. I had to work that day, so I figured I'd just celebrate by picking up some takeout and calling it a night. My parents didn't even mention it. Typical. But when I pulled up to Grandpa's house after work, I saw something sitting in his driveway. A car. Not just any car. A 1967 Mustang Fastback. It was in rough shape. The paint was faded, rust creeping along the fenders, the tires half flat. The front grille was missing, and the engine, well, from the looks of it, it hadn't run in years. I walked up to it slowly, my heart pounding. "Happy birthday, kid," Grandpa said, tossing me the keys. I caught them, barely able to speak. "Is this for me?" He nodded, grinning. "She ain't pretty now, but she's got good bones. Just needs someone who knows what they're doing to bring her back to life." I ran my fingers over the hood, feeling the rough metal beneath my hands. "Grandpa, I can't take this." "Why the hell not?" he said, crossing his arms. "I've been holding on to this thing for years, waiting for the right time to fix her up, but I'm getting too damn old for it. Figured you'd put her to better use than I ever could." I swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say." He chuckled. "Then don't say anything. Just do what you do best. Fix her up." I looked at him, then back at the car. For the first time in my life, I felt like I actually had something that was mine. Something no one could take away. I gripped the keys tighter. "Yeah," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "I will." When I brought the Mustang home, my parents took one look at it and burst out laughing. "Jesus, Alex," my dad scoffed, shaking his head. "Did you seriously drag that pile of junk here?" Ryan smirked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "You know you can actually buy cars that work, right?" My mom sighed dramatically. "I just don't get why you waste your time on things like this. That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not our driveway." I didn't bother arguing. I just pocketed the keys and walked past them. Their opinions didn't matter. They never had. I spent every free second working on that car. When I wasn't at my job, I was in the garage, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease, figuring out how to bring the Mustang back to life. It wasn't easy. The body was covered in rust, the engine barely held together, and some parts were so corroded they crumbled in my hands. But the moment I looked at it, I knew it was worth saving. I poured every dollar I had into it. Every paycheck went toward new parts, engine components, transmission upgrades, suspension rebuilds. I scoured junkyards, hunted through online auctions, even traded labor at the shop for spare parts. When I couldn't afford something, I saved until I could. I taught myself everything I didn't already know. I learned how to strip and repaint a car from YouTube videos and long nights at Grandpa George's garage. I practiced sanding metal until my arms ached, learning how to make the surface smooth as glass. I studied wiring diagrams, rebuilt the electrical system from scratch, and spent weeks fine-tuning the engine, making sure every bolt was tightened to perfection. The process was brutal. There were nights when I sat in the garage, exhausted, staring at the half-assembled mess in front of me, wondering if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But then I'd hear Grandpa's voice in my head. Real talent needs to be supported, not ignored. And I'd get back to work. My parents barely noticed. Ryan would roll his eyes whenever he saw me working on it, muttering something about how I was wasting my life. My mom made a few passive-aggressive comments about how a normal kid would be out having fun, not playing mechanic. My dad just acted like it didn't exist. That was fine. I didn't do this for them. A year later, the Mustang was finished. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was mine. The deep green paint gleamed under the garage lights, polished to a mirror shine. Every inch of chrome was flawless, every panel straight, every piece carefully restored. The black leather seats were new, stitched by hand after I spent weeks figuring out how to upholster them myself. The engine, was a masterpiece. A rebuilt 390 V8, every component either refurbished or brand new. tuned to perfection. The final moment came on a quiet evening. The garage door was open, the sun casting a warm glow over the hood of the car as I slid into the driver's seat. My hands shook slightly as I turned the key. The Mustang roared to life. That sound, deep, powerful, alive, sent a thrill through me unlike anything I had ever felt. I pressed the gas lightly, and the engine growled in response, smooth and strong. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never known in my own home. Victory. Not the kind that comes from beating someone else. Not the kind my parents gave to Ryan on a silver platter. This was different. This was something I had built with my own hands. Something no one could take away from me. I climbed out of the car and leaned against the hood, staring at it, heart pounding. I had done this. Me. And for once, I didn't need anyone's approval to know that it mattered. Ryan noticed the Mustang the second I pulled it out of the garage. He had never cared before, never even glanced at it while I was covered in grease, working late into the night, rebuilding it from the ground up. But now that it was finished, now that it shined, roared, and turned heads, he suddenly couldn't take his eyes off it. "Damn, Alex," he said, circling the car like a vulture. "This thing is actually sick. Never thought you'd pull it off." I leaned against the door, wiping my hands on a rag. "Yeah, well, I did." He ran his hand along the hood, nodding approvingly. "So, when are you going to let me take it for a spin?" I let out a short laugh. "Never." His smile faltered. "Oh, come on, man. Just for a little bit. Let me take it around the block." "No." His expression hardened, his usual smug confidence flickering into something else, something I had seen before when he didn't get what he wanted. "Why are you being such a dick about it? It's just a car." I clenched my jaw, shoving the rag into my back pocket. "It's not just a car, Ryan. I spent a year working on this. Every dollar I made, every hour I had, went into building it. I'm not letting you take it for a spin just so you can show off to your friends and treat it like a toy." He scoffed, stepping back. "Jesus, you don't have to be so dramatic. It's not like you even use it that much. You act like I'm asking to steal it or something. You're not asking. You're expecting." That was the thing with Ryan. He always thought he deserved whatever he wanted. And when someone told him no, it was like he couldn't process it. I thought that would be the end of it, just another petty argument between brothers. But then my parents got involved. It started small. Offhand comments from my mom about how I should be nicer to Ryan and let him have a little fun since he's never had a car of his own. My dad dropping casual remarks about how generous older brothers should be and how it would build character to share. I ignored it. They had never cared about the Mustang before, and I wasn't about to let them guilt me into handing it over now. But then came the family dinner that turned it into a full-blown war. We were sitting at the dining table, the usual forced conversation filling the room. My mom was talking about some charity event she was helping organize. Ryan was rambling about how he needed a new laptop for college. My dad was on his second beer, mostly silent. I was just trying to eat and get out of there as fast as possible. Then, my dad casually put his fork down and looked straight at me. "You know, Alex, I've been thinking," he said. "That Mustang of yours seems like a real waste just sitting in the garage." I froze mid-bite, already knowing where this was going. "Ryan's heading to college soon," he continued, ignoring the way I stiffened. "And he's going to need a car. I was thinking it makes the most sense for him to take the Mustang with him." I set my fork down slowly, my stomach twisting. "Excuse me." My mom nodded approvingly, like this had been a well-thought-out plan instead of the absolute nonsense it was. "It's only fair, Alex. You don't even need a car for work. And Ryan is going to be commuting. It would really help him out." Ryan smirked, leaning back in his chair like this had been decided already. "Yeah, man, it just makes sense. I mean, you can always get another one, right?" Something inside me snapped. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "No." My dad's expression darkened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, my voice steady. "That car is mine. I built it. I paid for it. I put in the work. Ryan didn't lift a damn finger, and I am not handing it over just because you think he needs it more than I do." Ryan let out an exaggerated sigh. "Dude, why are you being so selfish? It's just a car." I turned to him, my pulse pounding. "If it's just a car, then go get your own." The room went dead silent. My dad narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "You need to learn to think about family, Alex. Your brother is heading to college. This could really help him. And I needed my parents to show up at my graduation." I shot back, my voice cold. "But I guess we don't always get what we want, do we?" My mom gasped like I had just slapped her. Ryan rolled his eyes. My dad's face turned red, his grip on his beer tightening. "You're being ridiculous," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You have no reason to hold on to that car when Ryan actually needs it." I straightened my shoulders, planting my feet. "I have every reason. Because it's mine." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. We raised you to be better than this. to care about your family. And here you are, hoarding something that could help your brother just because of your damn pride. I stared at him, my hands shaking, my chest tight with anger. You didn't raise me, I said quietly. You raised Ryan. I turned and walked out, leaving my half-eaten dinner on the table. I could hear my mom calling after me, my dad muttering something under his breath, Ryan making some snide comment. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down. 2 weeks. That was all the time I was gone. Grandpa George had fallen ill, and I had dropped everything to be with him. He had always been there for me, and I wasn't about to leave him alone in a hospital bed while my parents barely acknowledged his existence. So I packed a bag, drove out to his place, and spent every day sitting by his side, listening to his stories between rounds of medication and doctor visits. The Mustang stayed locked in the garage at home, safe, or so I thought. When I finally pulled into the driveway after 2 long weeks, the first thing I noticed was that something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The garage door was closed, but there was an emptiness in the air, a gut-wrenching hollowness that hit me before my brain even caught up. I rushed to the garage, unlocked it, and yanked the door open. Empty. The Mustang was gone. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the vacant space where it had been. My hands clenched into fists, my pulse roaring in my ears. I turned and stormed into the house. My parents were sitting in the living room like nothing had happened. My dad was watching TV, beer in hand, and my mom was scrolling through her phone. Ryan was nowhere in sight. Where's my car? I demanded, my voice sharp and cold. They barely looked up. My dad took a slow sip of his drink, then exhaled like I had just inconvenienced him. We gave it to Ryan. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. You what? My mom set her phone down, finally glancing at me with a look that was far too calm for the situation. We transferred the Mustang to Ryan. He's the legal owner now. Everything inside me froze. Legal owner. The words hit me like a hammer. That's impossible, I said, my voice dangerously low. That car was mine. The title was in my name. You had no right. My dad sighed like he was already tired of this conversation. We did what was best for the family, Alex. Ryan needed a car for college. You don't need it. It made the most sense. My breath came fast and uneven as I struggled to process what I was hearing. How? I asked through gritted teeth. How did you even transfer the title? That was when my mom hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the guilt flicker across her face before she masked it with her usual indifference. My stomach twisted. I took a slow step forward. Tell me. My dad finally turned to look at me, and there was something smug in the way he did it, something that made my skin crawl. We signed it over, he said simply. Ryan is the legal owner now. I shook my head. You mean I signed it over? Silence. And then I understood. They had forged my signature. My parents. The people who raised me. The people who ignored me my entire life, who never supported me, who had barely looked in my direction unless it benefited Ryan, had committed fraud just to take the one thing I had worked for. You stole my car, I whispered. My mom crossed her arms. Don't be so dramatic, Alex. We made the best decision for everyone. Ryan needed it more than you did. You can always get another one. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Another one? Do you have any idea what that car meant to me? I ran a hand through my hair, my heart hammering in my chest. That Mustang wasn't just a car. I built it. I spent a year of my life making it what it was. I put everything into it. I turned to my dad, my voice shaking with rage. And you just handed it over like it was nothing. He shrugged. Ryan is the one going to college. You'll be fine without it. I clenched my jaw, my entire body rigid with fury. That car was mine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Legally. Rightfully. And you knew that. That's why you had to forge my signature like a couple of criminals. Watch your tone, my dad snapped, his patience wearing thin. Or what? I shot back. You'll steal something else from me? My mom let out an exasperated sigh. Honestly, Alex, you're acting like we ruined your life. It's just a car. You should be happy for your brother instead of making everything about you. I let out a slow, steady breath, forcing myself to stay in control. If I didn't, I was going to destroy something. I hope you both understand something, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. This? What you did? It's illegal, and I'm not letting it slide. My dad scoffed. Oh, come on. You're not actually going to make a big deal out of this, are you? I didn't answer. I just turned and walked out of the house, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and fury. As soon as I was outside, I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. I found the number I was looking for and hit call. Hey man, came the familiar voice on the other end. What's up, Chris? I said, barely keeping my voice steady. I need your help. My parents just stole my car, forged my signature, and transferred the title to my brother. What do I do? There was a beat of silence. Then, Chris exhaled sharply. "Meet me at my office," he said. "We're going to fix this." Chris didn't waste any time. The second I walked into his office, he was already pulling up legal references, jotting down notes, and asking me for every piece of proof I had. He was my old friend from high school, now a damn good attorney, and when I told him what my parents had done, he didn't even hesitate. "We're going after them," he said firmly, flipping through a legal pad. "This isn't just some petty family argument. They committed fraud, identity theft, and grand theft auto. You could have them arrested for this." I exhaled slowly, my fists clenched. "Good. Let's do it." We spent the next 2 days gathering every shred of evidence. First, I pulled up every bank transaction I had made during the time I was gone. Receipts from restaurants, gas stations, and stores all in Michigan, proving I wasn't anywhere near home when my parents had forged my signature. Then came the physical evidence. I had saved everything related to the Mustang. Every receipt for parts, every invoice from suppliers, every single dime I had spent restoring it. Chris went through them one by one, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't just some car you owned. You built this thing from the ground up. No judge is going to see this as anything but theft." Next, I found my photos and videos. For the past year, I had documented almost every step of the Mustang's restoration. Before and after shots, progress updates, engine rebuild footage. It was all there, time-stamped and undeniable. But the nail in the coffin? Chris made a few calls and managed to get footage from a bank's ATM in Michigan, recorded on the exact day my parents had transferred the Mustang to Ryan. The footage showed me standing in front of the ATM, withdrawing cash hundreds of miles away from home. "There it is," Chris said, leaning back in his chair. "Proof that you physically could not have signed those documents." I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just about getting my car back anymore. They had stolen from me, lied to me, betrayed me, and they had done it with complete confidence that I wouldn't fight back. They thought they could take the one thing I had worked for, erase me like they had done my whole life, and get away with it. They were wrong. Chris helped me draft an official police report, listing every charge. Identity theft, fraud, forgery, grand theft auto. We attached every document, every piece of proof, and I signed it without hesitation. When I handed it to the officer at the police station, I looked him dead in the eye. "They decided to ruin my life," I said, my voice steady. "Now I'm going to destroy their perfect image." It was time for them to learn what it felt like to lose something they thought was theirs to control. The knock on their door came early in the morning. I wasn't there to see it, but Chris later told me the officers had arrived with full force, 2 patrol cars, an unmarked vehicle, and a team ready to execute the arrest warrants. My parents had no idea what was coming. According to the police report, when my dad opened the door, still in his robe, and saw the officers standing there, his first response was irritation. "What's this about?" he had asked, probably assuming it was some misunderstanding, maybe even a routine question. But when they told him they had a warrant for his arrest, for identity theft, fraud, and grand theft auto, his face drained of color. My mom started screaming before they even got the cuffs on him. Ryan, who had been sleeping in, woke up just in time to see officers pushing his father into the back of a squad car. When they turned to him and said, "Ryan, you are under arrest for grand theft auto and tampering with a VIN," he just stood there, frozen. By the time they were hauling him out, my mom was sobbing, trying to argue with the officers, demanding to know who had done this to them. She got her answer when she looked across the street and saw me standing there, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. The look she gave me, pure shock, betrayal, and fury, was almost laughable. Like she actually couldn't believe I had fought back. Like she thought she could destroy the one thing I had built and not face any consequences. But the real kicker came when the police found the Mustang. They had stashed it in a rented storage unit across town, under a name that wasn't even theirs. But the payments for the unit? Those were made with my dad's credit card. Sloppy work. They had really thought they could erase my name from the car's history and hide it until things blew over. It didn't take long for prosecutors to build their case. With the signed police report, video evidence, and fraudulent paperwork, the DA had more than enough to take it to court. My parents hired a lawyer, of course, and tried to argue that it was just a family dispute gone too far, but the state didn't see it that way. Forgery, identity theft, auto theft, fraud, conspiracy. It was too much to brush off. They tried to take a plea deal. The DA refused. The evidence was overwhelming, and no one wanted to cut a deal with people who had gone so far as to forge their own son's signature just to steal from him. So they went to trial. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the kind of place that stripped away every bit of arrogance and entitlement. My father sat there, stiff and humiliated, his once proud posture now slumped with the weight of his mistakes. My mother barely looked at me. Ryan, who had never faced real consequences a day in his life, kept shifting in his chair, unable to sit still. The verdicts came down fast. Ryan got 8 months in county jail for grand theft auto and tampering with a vehicle identification number. The judge made it clear that his attempts to cover up the theft were what landed him the harsher sentence. My father, who had orchestrated the whole thing, lost his job immediately after being convicted of fraud. His employer wanted nothing to do with someone with a criminal record. With no income and massive legal fees, their financial security collapsed overnight. My mother wasn't spared either. While her role had been less direct, she had still participated in the fraud. The judge handed her a $10,000 fine and 30 days in jail for conspiracy and aiding in identity theft. The fallout didn't end there. With legal fees piling up and no income, my parents lost their house within months. The bank took it back when they couldn't make the payments. They had no choice but to move into a cramped, run-down apartment on the other side of town, the kind of place they had always looked down on, the kind of place they had always thought they were too good for. Their social circles evaporated overnight. Friends stopped returning their calls. Ryan's future was wrecked. No college wanted to touch someone with a criminal record for auto theft. And me? I got my car back. The Mustang was towed back to my garage, untouched. As I ran my fingers over the hood, feeling the familiar cool metal beneath my hands, I let out a slow breath. It had always been mine. And now, legally and undeniably, it was mine again. I had won. They had spent my whole life acting like I was nothing, treating me like an afterthought, pushing me aside to make way for Ryan. They had never seen me as someone worth respecting, someone strong enough to fight back. Now, they had lost everything, and I had finally taken back what was mine. With my Mustang finally back in my hands, I knew exactly where I needed to go. I packed up what little I cared to keep, threw my duffel bag in the trunk, and drove straight to Michigan. Back to the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Back to Grandpa George. He wasn't doing well. The illness had taken more out of him than he let on during my last visit, and when I walked into his small house, I could see it in his eyes. He knew he didn't have much time left. But when he saw me standing there, when he heard the familiar rumble of the Mustang pulling into the driveway, he grinned like he had just won the lottery. "Still runs like a beast, huh?" he said, his voice weaker than I remembered, but still filled with pride. "Runs better than ever," I said, sitting next to him. "And I got it back, Grandpa. They tried to take it, but I fought. And I won." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn right you did. Knew you would." For the next few months, I stayed with him, helping him around the house, making sure he was comfortable, just being there the way no one else in the family ever had. We spent our days in his garage, tinkering with old parts, reminiscing about engines, life, and the way hard work always pays off in the end. "You're tougher than they ever gave you credit for, kid," he told me one night as we sat outside, watching the sun set over the trees. "They thought they could break you, but here you are, stronger than all of them." I swallowed hard, nodding. I had a good teacher. He smiled, then reached out and patted my shoulder. "Damn right you did." When he passed away a few months later, I felt like I had lost the only real family I had ever had. But I also knew he went peacefully, knowing that I was okay, that I had fought for myself and won, that I wasn't going to let the past define me. The funeral was small, a handful of old friends, neighbors, a few guys from his time in the service. My parents didn't even bother to show up. I hadn't expected them to. But what I didn't expect was the bombshell that dropped shortly after. When the lawyer gathered everyone for the reading of Grandpa's will, I sat in the back, not expecting much. He didn't have much to leave behind. A small house, an old garage, a few savings. But when the lawyer read the will, my father's face turned pale. "To my grandson, Alex," the lawyer read, his voice steady, "I leave everything. My house, my land, my savings, and my shop. He is the only one who understands the value of real work, the only one who has earned it." Silence. I turned to look at my father. His expression was frozen in shock, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. My mother sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. They had expected to get something. They had expected to be in control, even now. But Grandpa had seen them for who they were, and he had made his choice. The lawyer handed me an envelope, separate from the rest of the documents. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this personally," he said. I opened it, my hand steady. Inside was a single handwritten note, short and to the point, just like the man himself. "Son, you are the only one who understood the value of real work. I am proud of you." That was it. And it was everything. I folded the note carefully, tucking it into my pocket. My father looked like he wanted to say something, like he was scrambling for a way to argue, to demand, to take. But he had nothing. I stood up, nodding to the lawyer, then turned to leave. I didn't look back. That was the last time I ever saw them. With the house and shop now legally mine, I started over. I used what Grandpa left me to open my own garage, fixing up cars, restoring classics, doing what I loved. My Mustang sat parked out front, a symbol of everything I had fought for, of everything I had survived. I had no regrets. They had spent my entire life treating me like I was nothing. Now, they had nothing. And me? I had everything I needed. Life in Michigan turned out to be exactly what I needed. With the house and shop left to me, I finally had the space to build something for myself, something that wasn't controlled or taken away by people who never truly cared about me. I started working at a local auto shop, a small but respected place where skill actually mattered more than family connections or empty promises. My boss, an older guy named Tom, saw my work, and within months, I became one of his most trusted mechanics. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just working to survive, I was working because I loved it. I woke up every morning knowing I was doing something that mattered, something I was damn good at. The guys at the shop weren't just coworkers, they became real friends. People who respected me, valued my skill, and treated me like I was worth something. I finally knew what it was like to be surrounded by people who didn't see me as less. Every Sunday, I kept a ritual that had become sacred to me. I would take my Mustang, now fully restored and gleaming under the morning light, and drive to the coast. I'd park near the water, sit on the hood, and let the sound of the waves drown out everything else. It was my way of remembering Grandpa George, of honoring everything he had taught me, everything he had given me. He had believed in me when no one else had. He had seen my worth when my own parents never had. And because of him, I had found my own way. I never heard from Ryan again. After his 8 months in jail, he had disappeared from my life entirely, which suited me just fine. My parents, though, weren't as eager to let go. At first, they pretended nothing had happened, sending passive-aggressive emails about how families should always stick together. When that didn't work, my mother left me voicemail after voicemail, her voice shaking with fake emotion, telling me how things got out of hand and how they never meant for it to go that far. My father, on the other hand, had the audacity to send a single, curt text. "We need to talk." I never answered. They had made their choices. They had stolen from me, betrayed me, laughed in my face while they took away everything I had worked for. And now that they had nothing, they suddenly wanted me back? No, they weren't my family. They had lost the right to call me their son the moment they forged my name and handed over my life to someone else. So I ignored every message, every call, every pathetic attempt to worm their way back into my world. I owed them nothing. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I climbed into my Mustang, resting my hands on the wheel. The leather was warm from the sunlight, the engine humming beneath me like a living thing, ready to go wherever I told it to. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The past was behind me. The betrayals, the neglect, the years spent fighting for something that was never going to be given to me. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had built my life with my own hands, earned every piece of it, and there was nothing left tying me to the people who had once tried to break me. I took a deep breath, pressed my foot down on the gas, and watched as the world blurred past me. The road stretched ahead, open and endless, waiting for me to take it. And for the first time in my life, I was truly free. When I first got the legal notice, I couldn't believe how desperate my parents had become. After everything that had happened, after their arrests, their convictions, and their complete downfall, they still thought they had a chance to take something from me. They had already lost everything, yet somehow, they convinced themselves that they could undo the consequences of their own actions. The lawsuit was their last pathetic attempt at control. They were trying to invalidate Grandpa George's will, claiming that I had manipulated him into leaving everything to me. They accused me of coercing a dying man, taking advantage of his health, and tricking him into signing documents that he didn't fully understand. As if my grandfather hadn't been the only person in my family who truly saw me for who I was. As if he hadn't spent his entire life watching my parents favor Ryan and ignore me. As if he hadn't made his own decision, knowing exactly what he was doing. On top of that, they were trying to reclaim the Mustang. Their argument was laughable. They claimed that the car had always been a family vehicle, and that I had stolen it from them. They said it was meant to be passed down, and that I had no right to keep it for myself. They didn't even have the self-awareness to feel embarrassed about how ridiculous they sounded. I took the lawsuit to Chris, who barely made it through reading the documents before shaking his head in disbelief. He tossed the papers onto his desk and let out a short laugh before looking at me. They're delusional. This isn't even a real case. It's a tantrum in legal form. They have no standing, no evidence, and no argument that would hold up in court. I already knew they wouldn't win, but I still asked, "Is there even a small chance I need to worry about this?" Chris leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Not even remotely. The will was legally drafted, notarized, and signed with witnesses. Your grandfather's medical records show he was fully competent when he made those decisions. The Mustang was always yours, and the paperwork proves it. This case won't even make it past the first hearing. If anything, we should be countersuing them for harassment. Still, I wanted to make sure there was no possible way they could weasel their way out of this. Chris and I gathered everything we needed. We had the official notarized copy of Grandpa's will, which explicitly stated that everything was left to me. We had medical records proving that his mind was sharp until the very end, making it impossible for them to argue that he was manipulated. We had the original bill of sale for the Mustang, along with every single receipt for its restoration, proving that the car had always been mine. Just to be safe, Chris also included their criminal records from the fraud case, in case they wanted to pretend they were trustworthy people. The judge barely let them finish their opening argument before shutting the whole thing down. He called it a blatant attempt to manipulate the court for financial gain and dismissed the entire case within 20 minutes. My mother tried to plead her case, but the judge wasn't having it. My father looked like he wanted to explode, gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Ryan just sat there in stunned silence, as if he had genuinely believed this would work. Chris clapped me on the back as we walked out of the courtroom and into the bright afternoon light. Well, that was almost too easy. I was hoping they'd at least put up a fight so I could drag them through the mud a little longer. I let out a small chuckle, shaking my head. I think they finally understand that they've lost. Across the parking lot, I saw my parents standing by their old, dented car. Their faces were blank, their expressions hollow. They had spent so much time trying to take from me, trying to control me, and trying to keep me beneath them. Now, they had nothing. No house, no money, no control. They had finally hit the point where there was no one left to blame but themselves. I climbed into my Mustang, gripping the steering wheel with steady hands. As I turned the key and felt the engine rumble beneath me, I took one last glance in the rearview mirror. The past was behind me, distant and irrelevant. I had built a new life, earned everything I had, and taken back what was mine. I pressed down on the gas, feeling the power surge forward as I sped out of the parking lot. They had spent years trying to take everything from me. Now, they had nothing, and I had everything I needed. When Chris and I sat down to go over the lawsuit, he barely managed to suppress his laughter. He skimmed through the pages, shaking his head in disbelief before tossing the documents onto his desk with a smirk. They really had no idea when to quit. Even after everything they had already lost, they still thought they could manipulate the system and come out on top. Chris wasted no time tearing their claims apart. First, he addressed their ridiculous attempt to reclaim the Mustang. The car had been legally transferred to me by my grandfather while he was still alive, meaning it was never part of his estate in the first place. That alone made their case dead on arrival. But Chris went even further, attaching all the original ownership documents and the title history to prove that they had absolutely no legal ground to challenge it. He also referenced the previous criminal case, where a court had already ruled that they had stolen the car from me and that it had been legally returned. The judge took one look at the argument and refused to even hear it, dismissing it outright as a waste of the court's time. Then came the claim about my grandfather's will. My parents had tried to argue that I had manipulated him into signing everything over to me, but their argument collapsed the moment Chris presented the facts. My grandfather had signed his will with a notarized witness through an independent attorney, someone completely unaffiliated with me, who had personally confirmed that my grandfather was in full mental capacity at the time of signing. The medical records were just as airtight, proving that he had been mentally sound with no signs of cognitive decline or coercion. Their entire case was built on desperation, and it crumbled the second it was exposed to reality. But I wasn't just going to sit back and defend myself. Chris had already drafted a counter-lawsuit for defamation and malicious prosecution, arguing that their baseless claims were nothing more than an attempt to harass me, damage my reputation, and drain my resources. He brought up their past criminal records from the stolen Mustang case, making it clear that they had a pattern of trying to manipulate the system for their own benefit. He laid out the financial burden they had tried to force on me with this lawsuit and demanded full reimbursement for all legal fees. By the time we entered the courtroom, it was already over. The judge barely let them speak before dismissing their entire case, stating that it was legally unfounded and a blatant abuse of the court system. When my parents tried to argue, he shut them down immediately, his patience clearly gone. Then came the final blow. The judge turned to my parents with a cold, measured stare and, in a tone that left no room for argument, issued them a warning. He told them that this was their second attempt at using the legal system to manipulate and harass me, and if they ever filed another frivolous lawsuit, they would be facing severe financial penalties. My father, who had been so confident walking into the courtroom, looked like someone had punched him in the gut. My mother sat completely frozen, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Even Ryan, who had been sitting in silence, suddenly looked like he had finally realized they were in a hole they would never climb out of. Then, the final decision came down. Because of my successful counter-lawsuit, the court ruled that my parents were responsible for paying every cent of my legal fees. They had not only lost, but they had now made their financial situation even worse. With no steady income and their legal bills piling up, they had just destroyed whatever little stability they had left. Chris was grinning as we walked out of the courthouse, tucking the case files back into his briefcase. "That was almost too easy," he said, shaking his head. "Think they finally learned their lesson?" I glanced back one last time, watching my parents still sitting in the courtroom, staring blankly at the floor, completely broken. I smirked. Yeah, I think they got the message. By the time I pulled out of the parking lot in my Mustang, I knew without a doubt that this was the last time they would ever try to come after me. They had spent years treating me like I was nothing, trying to control me, belittle me, and take everything I worked for. Now, they had nothing left to take, and I had everything I needed. After the court case was over and the final blow had been dealt, I thought I had finally put them behind me. I thought they would disappear from my life, too humiliated and defeated to try anything else. But I had underestimated their desperation. It started with my mother. A long, rambling text message that read more like a script from someone trying to save face than an actual apology. She talked about how families go through rough patches and how we've all made mistakes, but we can move past them. She told me that I was being stubborn by holding on to the past, and that it was time to let it go and be a family again. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. Then my father tried. Unlike my mother, he didn't bother pretending that what they did was wrong. His voicemail was short and to the point, his voice carrying the same authoritative weight he used to try and control me with. He said that family has to stick together, that I needed to be reasonable, and that it was time to stop acting like a child and come home. As if I was the one who had burned everything to the ground. I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. Then Ryan, the brother who had spent his entire life taking without consequence, decided to reach out. His message was almost laughable. He didn't apologize, didn't admit to anything, didn't even acknowledge what had happened. Instead, he tried to justify himself, playing the victim as if he had been forced into everything. He told me that I was being unfair, that he just wanted to live a little better, and that if I had been in his position, I would have done the same thing. I laughed when I read it. Then I blocked his number. One by one, I cut them all off. No more texts. No more voicemails. No more chances. They had spent their entire lives treating me like I was nothing, taking from me, pushing me aside, and expecting me to accept it without complaint. And when I had finally stood up for myself, when I had taken back what was mine, they still thought they could manipulate their way back in. They thought I would forgive them. They thought I would forget. But they had never really known me. I was done. I walked outside into the cool evening air, the sky painted in streaks of deep orange and violet as the sun dipped below the horizon. My Mustang sat in the driveway, waiting for me, gleaming under the fading light. I ran my fingers along the hood, feeling the warmth of the metal beneath my touch, knowing that this life I had built for myself, was mine. No one else had given it to me. No one else had the power to take it away. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, feeling the smooth leather beneath my hands. The engine roared to life as I turned the key, the deep, steady growl filling the air. I took one last glance in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing left to see. No ghosts of the past. No chains holding me down. Just the open road ahead, stretching endlessly beneath the evening sky. I pressed down on the gas, feeling the rush of speed as the Mustang surged forward. And this time, I never looked back. And that's it. That's how it all ended. They tried everything, manipulation, theft, fraud, even the courts, to take what was mine. And in the end, they lost everything. I walked away with my life, my freedom, and my dignity intact. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their own actions. But now I have to ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought the way I did, or would you have walked away sooner? Do you think I should have given them one last chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know your thoughts, because as far as I'm concerned, I have no regrets. I won, and they will never be a part of my life again.